de l'espace. Nous visionnerons d'abord le documentaire The Fall of Aztlan de l'artiste, cinéaste et éducateur latino-américain José Luis Benavides. Il commentera son travail en complément spécialement pour notre colloque, on le remercie, titulaire d'une maîtrise de la Wilbur Wright College, City Colleges of Chicago. Il a récemment tenu son premier spectacle solo à Terremoto, La Postal au Mexique. Son travail a récemment été présenté dans plusieurs festivals et événements cinématographiques à travers les États-Unis, le Mexique et l'Europe. Pour plus de détails, vous pouvez aller voir sur notre site aussi du colloque, on a mis les biographies de nos participants. Il sera suivi de Rachel Lobo, doctorante à la Faculté des aménagements environnementaux et urbains de l'Université York, avec l'appui du CRSH. Ses recherches explorent le potentiel des archives photographiques dans le maintien de l'histoire de la lutte politique et la promotion de l'échange des connaissances intergénérationnelles. Elle a reçu une maîtrise en conservation, obtenu une maîtrise en conservation photographique et gestion des collections de l'Université Ryerson. Elle a effectué des stages d'archives au Musée royal de l'Ontario et au Ryerson Image Center. Elle a publié des travaux dans Archivaria, le journal for the Association of Canadian Archivists et the International Journal of Canadian Studies. Elle nous présente aujourd'hui Black Geographies and Photographic Archives, the Alvin D. McCurdy Founds. Nous allons commencer avec José Luis Benavides et oui, on va vous inviter après une période de questions avec notre modérateur qui est toujours Clément Decaux. Merci beaucoup. José, just forget your volume. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction. Désolé, je n'ai pas parlé pas français. So I will be speaking in English. I do speak Spanish. If anyone has a question in Spanish, I can speak Spanish well and read it and translate, and I can understand a little French because of the Spanish connection. But thank you. Can I share screen now?
Yes, just if you want to put some volume in the video, you
Yes.
can click on share or integrate. I don't know how it spells.
Optimize audio. Thank you. I will.
Include something like that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. 1 second. Okay. Right. I hope you see the screen, the slide, introduction slide for my talk on the fall of Aztlan. Great, thank you. So this conversation and the hybrid presentation I'll be making with a sketch for one of my video works that I'm currently still making will traverse a history that is 900 years in the making, relatively speaking. But first, I would like to make a land acknowledgement for the lands that I'm standing on or sitting in here in Chicago as Western settlers now call the region. The city of Chicago in the United States is and stands on ancestral lands of many peoples, predominantly though the people of the Three Fires or the Three Fires Council, which consist of Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi peoples, who again call these lands their ancestral homes. And there are many other peoples who still live in the area. And that's exactly where I am and where the project needs to sort of situate itself. Coming at the work methodologically from a critical Latinx indigeneities stance, recent sort of framework posited by Blackwell, Lopez, and Urieta in recent scholarship, the lens of critical Latinx indigeneities um, aims to contextualize the power relationships and multiple colonialities between indigenous peoples and settlers and in these homelands of the Americas in a hemispheric approach across the hemisphere that aims at the complex sort of issue of how indigenous peoples from one part of the Americas can resettle and become settlers in new areas where there are already indigenous peoples, and then ticing out the complexities of those relationships. And Latinx people, of which I can be categorized under as a Chicanx person of Cuban ancestry, fall kind of in this framework and these questions. So with that, and trying to understand it from an intersectional lens, how do we question our settler colonial roles as migrant peoples of indigenous heritage too? But to understand the history of that I'm speaking of, specifically the context of the idea of Aztlán as a place, as a mythology, as an ideology, as mentioned in Chicano literature and history, history books, from all of these different vantage points, understanding critical Latinx indigeneities kind of posits Aztlán as a problem of ideology and nationalism of the Chicano movement born out of the 1960s that kind of reifies or reamplifies certain problems of thinking, a framework, of a mindset that have roots in the ideas of Vasconcelos, La Raza Cósmica, which is heart of a sort of eugenics and whitening project of mestizaje that again is sort of erasing the indigenous aspects of and the indigenous peoples and the various communities and peoples that live across Mexico and out throughout the Southwest, their particularities, their nuances, their differences into this homogenizing project of Mexican nationalism that kind of gets retranslated into Chicano nationalism from the 20s through to the 60s. So redressing these violent settler colonial ideologies and language is at the core of my project and what I'm trying to bring up and address. Right, that there are many indigenous peoples that still live in the Southwest, that the ideology of Aztlán sort of again recolonizing in even an indigenous fashion is erasing and doing the opposite of what it's intending to try to do in reclaiming indigenous heritage as a group. The Chicanos sort of dropped the ball. This all starts in the 1960s again with the poet Alurista, who as a manifesto, as a political platform, posits this idea of, or restates this metaphor, this mythology from Mexica and Aztec mythology as a new mythology for the Chicano people to sort of see ourselves as from these lands just as much as we are, foreign or new as migrants from Mexico to the Southwest, but also from the Southwest inherently too. Again, there are problems with this rhetoric. You can see here the statement by Lurista as it's a founding document of Mecha, the chapter, the activist organization of which I was a part of when I was an undergrad. This group, Mecha, which I'll explain its name in a second. You can see it there, Movimiento Estudiantil Chicano de Aztlán, the Aztec student movement of Chicanos. Again, starts in the 60s with that document by Alurista, and then it becomes a national movement with chapters at universities and high schools across the country. We helped form a chapter in the university I went to in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, in the early 2000s. And recently, the organization and its national conferences, literally just last year, decided to take away the name Aztlán from the organization, a 50-year activist and student movement organization, decided to take the name away of Aztlán away and take out and remove also Chicano as two tenets of the ideology. And there are many reasons for that, which I support and are very contentious and pose a lot of questions. And that's what my video project is trying to delve into. You can just see here, of course, some of the examples of the news articles, like the previous one that came out within the last year about the controversy of the name and the fact that Aslan still exists as an ideology and why it needs to be changed or addressed. Mecha itself, again, Movimiento Estudiantil Chicano de Aztlán, is a, again, student activist organization from the 60s with very militant and nationalist affirmations of self that some can find, again, problematic or can see and deem necessary in a project and for peoples that are oppressed and trying to find self-determination, affirmation of self, cultural connections and heritage, while constantly under attack in the United States as foreign, outsider, other, and as our peoples are constantly being deported and attacked by we all know who. So here's some images from my own personal archive that inspired the work that I'm doing, where I'm trying to reach out to the former activists of the group that I was a part of. I've already done a lot of ethnographic research and Zoom interviews with most of the members. I'm trying to reach out nationally across to some of the other chapters. There are, again, about 3,000 chapters around the country. So this is a huge, political organization. And here you can see me in the middle with the long hair and the glasses. I used to have long hair. I used to have hair. In 2005, 2008, we formed the chapter, and we were quite proud to become a part of this history. So it's a real sort of challenge, for a lot of us to rectify what happened, what did we do wrong, or was it wrong to be a part of this group, although we're all still very proud to be activists and part of this conversation. Here you can see me again in the 2005 national marches for immigrant justice that we mobilized the indigenous communities and migrant communities of farm workers outside of our campus. It is a rural campus in Illinois. We are also part of mobilizing the students on campus to have very massive marches and in unison with the national marches that were happening for immigrant justice in 2005. From a methodological stance, I'm also very interested in Native American scholars and their work and contributions in critiquing and analyzing Aztlán, particularly the scholarship of Dylan A.T. Minor, Métis, a person of the Métis peoples, which is, you all probably know, a multi-ethnic group of peoples from the Canadian side and the US side of the border. So kind of touching close to home. And he posits Aztlán as an indigenous intervention into settler ontologies and colonial political formations that attempt to render Chicano presence as immigrant and therefore settler, as opposed to indigenous or in orientation. But he's also quite celebratory and appreciative of the history of Aztlán. He dedicates an entire book to it, as you can see here, where he's teasing out Chicano art, its symbols of Aztlán, its creation of Aztlán as an idea, as a rhetoric and a mythology within the Chicano movement, and an indigenous, in contention with indigenous sovereignties or affirming indigenous sovereignties through his metaphor of lowriding across a sort of unified idea of Turtle Island, the Americas. And so Aztlán has manifested in a lot of problematic ways in American history and literature. It's been claimed to be all over the continent in different places, from Wisconsin to New Mexico. Just everyone has claimed that Aztlán is in some way, in some place throughout the United States in very, very strange ways. My project is not about mapping where Aztlán is or where it specifically is located. But again, there are maps even in the colonial record that indicate where Aztlán might have been. Aztlán is, again, the myth of the Mexica Aztec peoples, of the origins of one tribe of peoples, of many tribes of peoples in Mexico, that where they left their mythical homeland of Aztlan, somewhere to the north, and then migrated into the center of Mexico, and then settled into Mexico City, where they, started the Aztec Empire. Lots of other things happened in between that, but this sort of origin story, this mythology of a people's, this migration from one place to another as a mythology is quite common in a lot of people's origins and transformation stories. And most notably, it's been documented in Nahua, the Mexica language, not only in the pictographic codices, that have survived because of colonization that were mostly destroyed. It's also been documented in the historical annals of peoples and scholars. You'll see in the video momentarily excerpts from one such annal that is by Chimalpahin, who, when I was living in the 15th, 16th century, on the sort of edge of both, and wrote in Nahua language and translated to Roman letters, Spanish, Latin. So it's documented in the histories, it's documented in the mythology, it's a belief system, but it's also this ideology. My stance and my interest here from an art historical stance is kind of more in lines with the work of scholars like Cohen Aponte Diaz in 2019, who talk about a polyglossic dialogue and polyphonic means of sort of listening to multiple voices all at once. My oral history approach and ethnography work with this story of my own involvement and relationship to Mecha, through to the mythologies of Aztlan and all the way back, there's also ideas that Nevarte Linares, from whom one of this assessment of this image that you're seeing from a codice, the codice, he describes as transversal, as a transversal landscape, whereby the depth and breadth of ideas and messages can unfold in this sort of chronotope. The chronotope is an idea that comes from Bakhtin in 1981. The chronotope being, of course, configuration of time and space that these codices can condense, that they speak within, multiple dimensions of time and reality, not just one, not just the two-dimensional image that we see, but they depict time and space in very, very, very compelling and deeper ways than even just our own reading in Western standards of reading could ever kind of comprehend. And so again, Linares is analyzing this from an art historical stance, and that's informing my approach to making the video art that you will see shortly. Linares also notes here that for the Mexica, their idea of Aztlan and their migration to their new homelands, Tenochtitlan, Mexico City, represents a sort of shift in mundus, or axis mundus, of their center of self, and their concept of the center of the universe being themselves as a people, moving from one locus to another. So we're talking about, again, this cosmology within Mexica and Aztec epistemologies and knowledge. So I, again, as an artist, am not trying to map where Aztlan is. It's not my interest. However, I'm looking at popular culture, and you can see here my project of mapping and trying to find Aztlan in the local landscape, the local space around me, about 12 to 30 miles around Chicago. You can see a list here of all of the locations that reference Aztlan in the name, from junkyards to planting services to restaurants. Aztlan is a part of our popular culture as peoples, as American peoples, as Chicanos, as Mexican immigrants. It is a huge facet of our identity that's beyond just the Chicano movement and its art moment and its sort of political agenda in the 60s as well. And so what you're about to see won't feature so many of these images, but this is probably the most exciting aspect of my research, that in this effort to sort of erase Aztlan or find Aztlan, from mythology, it transforms, it transmogrifies in all of these ways to end up being an actual locus on a map that we can pinpoint through NASA image and mapping of one of Saturn's moons, Titan, that is currently and has been for several decades being surveyed with aerial satellites and mapped with lidar mapping and radar mapping to find and study the origins of life. The conditions on Saturn, Saturn's moon Titan, are such that they resemble, as close as we can within our solar system, the preconditions of the origins of life on our own planet. And so if we can imagine that one day, if we don't destroy our planet completely and its natural resources, that we might eventually have to leave, you know, this might be a viable place for recolonization and for settlement. And in that effort, NASA has mapped already all of this moon's terrain, and they pinpointed a location called Aslan. They named it Aslan, as they named other sites on the moon based off of a new system that they're evolving of naming locations in our reach, or as we map our cosmos. They're naming it now based off of a new system that is mythologies of our planet Earth. So next to Aslan, there's Xanadu, which comes from other mythologies, and next to Xanadu, there's Greek locations in Greek mythology, and so we're remapping our own cosmology onto this location. It's very interesting and strange, and so now Aslan has an actual Google Map register officially provided by NASA. So I'm going to just show a clip here now from the video that I've been making, and again, understand it as a sketch. Understand that there's some problematic language from the folks that I've excavated from the archives, and my intervention as a poetic sort of gesture to queer these conversations, rooting myself in Cherry Moraga's notions of queer theory, Jack Happerstam's notions of the queer art of failure, and how I see Aslan as an epic failure of sorts, of an ideology of a people's trying to find sovereignty and self-determination. Aslan has fallen. Aslan is no longer this pillar of ideology, and so where do we start? Where do we reimagine ourselves? But this first section is about the idea of Aslan and Chicano sort of nationalist rhetoric. So it's a little cringy, but I'm trying to intervene on that with other images and things. Let me stop sharing this screen and share the video now very briefly. It's just an excerpt again from the section. So bear with me. Here we go. Please let me know if sound is coming through, and feel free to interrupt if I've gone over time. The sound isn't going through. I'll try again. I did hit the sound button, but I guess it's not happening. Okay, let me try one more time. And I will restart the video too.
And FYI, we still have about 5 minutes, but
Okay.
Since we have a discussion after, we might again go over if needed.
Okay. It should be a very short excerpt anyway, so I will let you call it. Share sound, optimize. It should be working, but let me try again.
As a colleague says, we heard some wind at start.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, yes, we did.
Huh, so it just stopped at some point. Okay, let me just try it again. Maybe the computer just...
Thank you.
Do you hear it now? No?
parejas se casaron en una iglesia en el centro de Filipinas. Oigan esto, pero también mírenlo, por protección al coronavirus. Cuando ve la neblina, oye, no voy a volar, mi hija puede perder este juego de baloncesto, como voy por carretera, pero demoraba mucho. Y tú me dices que vives en Los Ángeles, y es normal, esta neblina se ve allí muchísimos días. Efectivamente,
Somewhere in the 12th century, our Aztec ancestors left their ancient homeland of Aztlan and began a journey to the south. They were following the advice of their chief god, Huitzilopochtli, who had advised them that in that journey, the old would grow very old and die. The young would grow old. The children would grow to adulthood before they would reach the promised land.
We were so much older than that.
Yes, we're much younger than that now.
That's right. Okay, poem in lieu of preface. It is said, Kabet Kusuma, Monte Kusuma, Ilwikamina, sent an expedition looking for the northern mythical land where from the Aztecs came, La Tierra de Aztlan. Mythical land for those who dream of roses and swallow thorns, or for those who swallow thorns in powdered milk, feeling guilty about smelling flowers, about looking for Aztlan.
Aztlan was left in the north, but it was never forgotten. And Chicanos now living to the north of Mexico, Tenochtitlan, continue to search for it. Hoping is not to find it geographically, to find it in their hearts. Because exactly as we look into the past, so do we look into the future. Aztlan represents that time when we had total dignity. It now represents that time when we'll achieve that dignity once again.
In terms of poetry, the original term for poetry amongst the Nahuatl people, the Tolteca Maya people, was in Xochitl, in Cuica, flower in song. And it's a difracismo. We use two words. In Nahuatl, two words are used, two concepts are used to describe one reality, flor y canto. In flor y canto, poetry is the only way to express the truth.
Aún Tlatinemis conasitia sin Aztlan.
I'll stop it there. It's about 5 minutes. But thank you so much, everyone. I'm really excited to be here and hear our next speaker. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you so much. So we will welcome our next speaker, Rachel Lobo. Thank you so much. que pour votre information, ça ne sera pas bien long. On va trouver Rachel et tout va bien aller. Merci. Petit problème technique de ce côté, mais ne soyez pas inquiets, tout va bien. Je vais inviter notre modérateur Clément Decaux à lancer une première période de questions ciblées sur José Luis Benavides. Donc, Jose, we invite you for your period of question a bit earlier, if you don't mind, and we will direct questions to you directly. Thank you.
Okay, okay. Yeah. If I might also add something that I failed to mention while I was presenting, the work is sort of taking on this sci-fi tone, and you sort of saw that a moment of sci-fi intervention because of all of the images that I realized in preparing for this, implementing sci-fi methodologies, literally doing a sort of time travel to excavate the internet, you know, with these archival methods of looking at old outdated websites that NASA has disbanded, but that the images and the videos and the renders that they of the moon, Saturn, that has this location Aslan on it, have produced over the past couple of decades. I've been able to chart all of their progress from websites from the 1990s to now, again, defunct websites. So I'm actually in a process unintentionally of time travel that is quite interesting to approach this work from 900 years ago to now, right?
Yeah. Thank you, Jose, for adding that to your presentation. That was really interesting, truly interesting hearing you talking about it. And I have to say that I really like your methodology of mapping Atlan heritage through the streets of Chicago, sorry. And but maybe there's something I'd like to ask you. If anyone has questions, feel free to ask them in the chat, and I will read them out loud. But maybe to start, I'd like to hear you about how you see today's Aslan identity information being maybe how it molds or how it is shaped in tension with today's American nationalism, and how you see these two types of identity informing maybe one another.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. I hadn't really thought of Chicano nationalism as somehow birthed from American United States, to be more specific, nationalism. But because I always have seen, and I think a lot of people would historicize Aztlán and Chicano nationalism as born out of just a moment of civil rights and sort of parallel histories to the Black Panthers and to the Young Lords and other nationalist groups that formed out of the 60s as well, that are part of a racial reckoning, a sort of response to the intense racism, segregation, white supremacy, and white nationalism that exists in the United States, that was perhaps then in the 60s and 70s more and less visible and felt. The repercussions of it were worse than they are now, but maybe they were more invisible processes, right? That have physical manifestations in the South of the country, but that are kind of thought of as non-existent or a backwardsness to the North, to the more progressive, liberal parts of the country, the urban settings and things. But regardless of if these processes are invisible or if they are overt and visible, I think now the rhetoric of nationalism has obviously, hopefully, met its course, and that's perhaps also informing why Aslan has been taken out of the group's name, specifically addressing the students and what their justifications were, that Mecha and its population was starting to see more indigenous folks from non-Mexican origins and nationalities. Folks from Guatemala are starting to more migrate into like Southern California and be a part of these organizations there, from El Salvador. And these are not now, in that sense, Aztec or Mayan or Aztec or Mexica peoples. These are peoples from other tribes and other communities and speak other languages that are not even Nahua. So they're needing to expand and be more inclusive, not only of these other indigenous groups that are forming a part of their chapters, but also Afro-indigenous, Afro-identities and Afro-indigenous identities that are excluded in these terms of Mecha as a Mexican nationalist organization with a Mexican nationalist symbol of Aslan as its center. So it's very complicated, from the US side of it to all of these migrations, these erasures within the history, and how to be more inclusive.
Well, that's very interesting. And following up on how movement and identity come to get organized. I'd like to ask you, as we see through many movements within North America, many indigenous movements are led by women. And I'd like to hear you about the place of women in this imaginative processes going on that you talked about, but also in the organizing of movements and how it shapes specific identities in terms of gender, maybe also.
Yeah. So the chapter that I was a part of helping form was run completely by women. Most of the people you saw in the archival images, aside from the one that was just of me, were our sisters in arms. They're young Mexican. Some were not even only Mexican. We had Colombian friends and people that were of different nationalities helping us form our chapter in the early 2000s. But it was a woman-led organization. In the beginning, I was one of only one men that were a part of the group. We had advisors that were already graduate students that helped us sort of connect to the history and to read the history and to know how to form, like, the access points to get into the organization on a national level. So those may be some of the older men you saw floating around the image, but they're not part of the actual chapter. The chapter was run by us as undergraduate students, and that was women run. And that history has been obviously predominantly erased and sort of left out of the canon, but also redressed by, like, the folks that I mentioned, Cherry Moraga and other peoples who are thinking of Aslan and the Chicano movement in queer terms, in feminist terms, and have a long legacy of work to correct those erasures of the Chicano movement and its sort of masculinist agenda. I fall in that legacy not only as a queer man myself, but also having witnessed and only been allowed to have space or speak through the work of my fellow machistas that were women and are women mostly, doing the academic work and the groundwork of organizing.
Well, thank you. That's really interesting, looking in depth into that. And since we know we don't have any question in the chat, maybe I can ask one last question before we check on the next presentation. Many times through your presentation, you talk about ideology as imaginaries, as ideologies, and one or two times you contrasted it with a belief system. So you talk about an ideology or a belief system. I wonder if you could tell us a little more about how you think of it as an ideology and or not a belief system, and what are the differences between these two notions in your work?
Yeah, so when I mean belief, I mean indigenous epistemologies, mythology, and cosmologies. In that sense, it comes from oral history and indigenous perspectives and language, right? That it's documented historically, but it's a documentation that is of a belief system for a peoples, for the folks that speak Nawa and are raised in an actual indigenous context, not an indigenist context like Mecha, that is sort of appropriating, or the Chicano movement is sort of investing in our indigeneities, but in these kind of, as I even felt when we were in undergrad, in these very contentious ways. We were always very skeptical of our self-identification as Chicanos, because I'm even mixed in the sense that I'm Cuban and Mexican, and we were all mostly from the Midwest, so we have zero associations with the Southwest as a construction of the ideological locus of Aztlán from the Chicano movement. So we were, again, all of my compatriots and I, we were always debating these things. And as an ideology, it can be debated as much as it also can be pushed and sort of constructed to become a national identity marker. And that's sort of the difference, like the difference of it as a symbol, as an ideology and a marker, and you know, a tattoo to brand yourself with, versus coming from an originary people's origin story and a mythology that is complexly related to also Mexican nationalism. So it sort of transforms from a belief within a community and peoples to become absorbed by Mexican nationalism, to then sort of be reabsorbed by Chicano nationalism. And that nationalism is the ideology versus the belief system that is of and belonging to a sovereign people.
Well, thank you. It's really interesting how you look at it as with these two concepts, and how it can, like, it brings up questions about how maybe things could get organized in the future, and I'm sure you will be looking at the future of this movie quite closely.
Yeah.
Roxane, do we have any news about the next presentation?
Right now we don't. We try to establish connection. There's a little problem on that side. Par contre, on va pouvoir lancer la discussion joviale plus tôt. J'attends les communications en même temps. So, thank you. Yes, so for the next panelist, sadly, we can't invite her today. We will try to reach and place her on some other day. We will keep you informed. Nous allons vous informer si jamais on peut replacer la conférence qui devait avoir lieu juste à la suite de celle-ci sur une autre journée. On va vous tenir au courant sur nos différents canaux de communication. Toutefois, on avait une étape super à la fin de la journée où on invite tous les panélistes de la journée et les participants, les spectateurs, les modérateurs, le modérateur, le comité scientifique et l'organisation à poursuivre la discussion avec micro ouvert, caméra ouverte, un petit verre si vous en avez un à porter. Et on va lancer cette discussion-là plus tôt. Elle devait débuter à 4 heures. Je sais que ça peut être tôt dépendant de votre fuseau horaire pour un petit verre d'apéro, mais vous pouvez prendre un verre de thé ou comme vous voulez. Pour poursuivre ces discussions-là, si vous avez des questions que vous n'avez pas eu le temps de poser, c'est le moment. Si vous voulez en savoir plus sur le travail de nos panélistes, ça va être le moment aussi. Donc, je vais juste m'informer avec mon équipe technique pour être certaine que le lien est prêt pour lancer la discussion. Peut-être que Christopher peut prendre la parole verbalement pour que ce soit plus rapide pour nos communications, puisqu'on est tous sur le même canal. Et on va vous inviter à nous rejoindre sous peu, dis-je. Alors, je vais aussi profiter pour faire le petit mot de la fin. Thank you, José, for your presentation. It was very interesting. I'm looking forward to see the total result of it. Merci à Clément Decaux pour la modération de ce deuxième panel en après-midi. On a eu des discussions vraiment riches et on aurait pu continuer. Et c'est pour ça qu'on a une discussion après. Donc, vous pouvez vous joindre à nous et discuter de tout ça. Je vais laisser la parole à Christopher. Je crois qu'il est prêt à nous dire quelques mots, mais je voulais vous remercier personnellement pour cette belle première journée de colloque en mode COVID, en virtuel, ce qui a été tout un défi. Et merci de vous être joints à nous. Merci d'avoir été très... je sais que c'est difficile en mode webinaire où on ne voit pas les gens et on ne peut pas voir les réponses, comment ça se passe, mais on a eu des participants, ça s'est bien passé, les panélistes aussi. Donc, voilà, je laisse la parole à mon collègue et merci encore.
Oui, ça va être seulement technique. Je m'excuse, il y a des réparations dans l'appartement juste en dessous de chez nous, donc ça se peut que vous entendiez un éléphant pendant que je parle. Grosso modo, le technicien Frédéric est avec nous, va juste nous transférer de mode webinaire. Donc, si j'ai bien compris, vous allez tout avoir accès à vos caméras, tout avoir accès avec vos microphones, donc on va pouvoir discuter ensemble. Je vois que c'est déjà en train de se faire, donc là, vous pouvez allumer votre caméra, vous pouvez allumer votre microphone, c'est vraiment... Vous tombez en modérateur, c'est un peu ça qui se passe, là, donc on va pouvoir discuter plus librement que précédemment.
OK, j'inviterai les conférenciers et peut-être aussi le comité scientifique à allumer votre caméra. Déjà, ça peut dégêner les gens, mais vous êtes toutes libres de faire ce que vous voulez et de vous joindre à nous. Merci beaucoup. On peut discuter de tous les sujets que vous voulez. Vous pouvez aussi utiliser le chat sur le côté pour parler entre vous. Plus précisément, c'est des questions spécifiques à des gens, parce que des fois, ça peut être un peu cacophonique. Sur ce, moi, je vais fermer la caméra 5 petites minutes et je vous reviens tout de suite.